everyone, welcome to today's discussion on the India-China Triangle, past, present, and prospects. I'm Kirsten Hamann. I serve as the Interim Director of the India Center at UCF, and I'm also Pegsis Professor in the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs, where the India Center is housed, and I'm Associate Dean in the College of Sciences. It is an honor to welcome our speaker, Dr. Tanvi Madan, to our India Center event today. The India Center at UCF broadens the understanding and awareness of contemporary India. It promotes the study of India in the world today and the relationship between the United States and India through partnerships, scholarship and research, education, and outreach. Today's discussion addresses a timely and important topic. As I'm sure you're aware of, India has recently surpassed China as the most populous country globally. Today's discussion will focus on the connections between three large countries, India, the US, and China, which is a central security concern not just domestically, but also globally. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Tanvi Madan. Dr. Madan is a senior fellow in the Center for East Asia Policy Studies in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Dr. Madan is a member of the editorial board of Asia Policy and a contributing editor at War on the Rocks. She is also the host of the Global India podcast. Dr. Madan's blog explores India's foreign policy and role in the world, focusing on India's relations with the United States and China. She has appeared in many news outlets, including the BBC, Bloomberg, CNBC, Fox News, NPR, and PBS. Most recently, Dr. Madan is the author of the book, Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War. Her ongoing work includes a monograph on India's foreign policy diversification strategy. And before I welcome Dr. Madan and turn it over, I would like to thank just a few people in the audience. There's Laila Chako, the Director of Public Affairs of the India Center, and also several student volunteers and interns who have made this event today possible. Thank you all. It is now my honor to welcome Dr. Madan to present her talk on the India-US Triangle, past, present, China Triangle, otherwise it's not a triangle, past, present, and prospects. So you have about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and discussion. Dr. Madan.
Thank you very much, Dean. Also thank you to Laila Chako, to Wilson as well. It's great to be back here. I was here in 2017. I think this is working okay. Can you guys hear me? Great. And thank you all for spending an hour of your time. I don't know if it's a pizza or three big countries, but I'm glad you're here and that you will spend this next hour listening to me, or at least the first 40 minutes, and hopefully I'll spark some questions when we get to Q&A. When we think about the kind of India-US-China triangle, one of the things is it has not been the same form since India became independent in 1947 or since the People's Republic of China came into existence. We've seen it take different forms over the years. So in the early to kind of mid-1950s, you saw India and China kind of partnering with each other and relatively kind of, if not opposed to, a distant from the US. You then see kind of a period in which the US and India get closer to each other with China on the other side. So this triangle looks very different with different kind of partners and different rivals in this case. When you go to the kind of 70s and 80s, you see, and that the other thing that this shows is there is the India-US-China triangle, but you've always seen other countries involved with it, shaping the kind of triangle that exists. And in this case, in the 70s and 80s, it was the Soviet Union, that's the Soviet flag, next to India, and India partnered with Moscow, and the US and China were aligned with Pakistan as well. So, you know, not kind of it's a bit of a quint, not just a triangle as well. And then you go to the 1990s, where everybody was engaging with everybody. It's the post-Cold War phase. US-Soviet competition had faded, and you see kind of India engaged with China, the US engaged with China, and Pakistan also, where there's some amount of engagement. Fast forward to the last, to kind of since the turn of the century, essentially, what you've essentially seen is an evolution to where you see this, this kind of dispensation, where you're going back to that triangle that I showed you in the kind of 60s, with the US and India partnering, China seen as a rival, with Russia still an Indian partner, but frankly more close to China. So you're now seeing India and the US with kind of China and Russia aligned with each other in turn. Today I will be talking about the India-US-China triangle today, particularly in the context of intensifying US-China competition, or as some have labeled it, a new Cold War. The US-China competition being kind of this iteration of what used to be US-Soviet competition. But I'm also going to talk about, and I'll talk about how we kind of got here, why kind of India is now aligned with the US, though not allied, and why it's not partnering with China as it used to in the past. But also what I'm going to talk about is why today's, in the Cold War, India stayed non-aligned between the US and Soviet Union. It took a relatively middle path, occasionally partnered or aligned with one of the other superpowers, but it largely stayed non-aligned. But today I'm going to point out why today, taking that non-aligned option, walking that middle path, is not the option, is not a viable option for India anymore, and it's a different set of options today than it was in the old Cold War. What I'm going to try and do is weave together history and contemporary policy, also pointing where history can be a guide, it can be a useful lesson, it can teach us some useful lessons, but it can also have limitations if you start letting it be a straitjacket. That is, India was not aligned in the old Cold War, so it will be non-aligned today. That's not quite the path it's going to take. A few years ago in New Delhi, there was an exchange between two senior retired or former officials, a former American official, former head of Central Command, General Petraeus, and the former Indian Foreign Secretary who had just left office. Today is India's foreign minister, but was out of office at that time. And General Petraeus said, China is the defining, this was a few years ago, I think it was 2019, he said, China is the defining issue of our age, and seemingly in frustration added that countries such as India have to decide. He asked if India indeed could take a stand and choose a side, or was it always going to remain a non-aligned? And Dr. Jaishankar retorted, India should take a stand. It should take a side, our side. Now, many in India and the US interpreted his remark of saying, you know, India will take a side, our side, India's side, as suggesting that India's approach would be to US-China competition, would be to remain non-aligned, to walk a middle path, to avoid taking sides in the geopolitical competition unfolding between China and the United States, just as it did in the US-Soviet Cold War, so that India was again going to walk a middle path and not make decisions. Now, thanks to that Cold War prism in which many people look at India's choices, the debate often focuses on only two options that are possible when you're partnering. One, that you are an ally, so there's an alliance. The second is that you're going to be non-aligned, that you are, there's no kind of in-between option. Now, this is not just an academic point. The fact that people think that there are only two options is that either you have to be an ally or you're not aligned and you're on the opposite side, you're in the other bloc. So it shapes perceptions even in policy world about what is possible with a partner, with a country. And what this means is that because India says we don't do alliances, we're not going to, and we can talk about why in Q&A if you'd like, but India says we don't join treaty alliances or have mutual defense commitments. You have some in the US commentariat who will say, well, then what is the point of partnering with India? It's not going to be an ally, it's not going to be useful, why bother investing in it? In India, in turn, some dismiss a deeper partnership with the US because they say this will be a departure from our non-aligned position. and they want an alliance. We can't be that, so we should not partner with the US or deepen partners. So essentially it gets into India saying, or people in India saying, we don't want to be a US ally, and in the US people say, what's the point what's the point with it, partnering with India if it won't be an ally? Now, one of the things that I will talk about today is that this alliance versus non-alignment debate is very limiting, and it doesn't reflect the possibilities or of what is possible today, but also the differences between when India was faced looking at US-Soviet competition and what its options were then, and what its options are today in US-China competition. And so, if you're looking at it from an old Cold War prism, you think that this is the stand India is going to take. That India will say this is what the triangle will look like. India will take, this is its balancing act, it will stay kind of in the middle, it will have equidistant relationships with China and the US. When in reality, this is actually the situation. That India has a much more closer partnership with the US, and it is in India, there's not an ally, but it is also not non-aligned, and I'll talk about why. It is aligned because today its options are not the same as they were during the Cold War. Now let me go back and take you back to the Cold War and how people are looking at it today. And why people are using that analogy of when we see US-Soviet competition and say, oh, this is what US-China competition looks like, so let's go with that. Now just like several countries, India is also watching US-China competition as it unfurls very closely. Just as the debate in Washington and elsewhere, Indian analysts are comparing US-China competition with US-Soviet competition and asking, is this a new Cold War that we're seeing? Now this is not surprising that people are making these comparisons. There are, after all, certain similarities between US-Soviet competition and US-China competition as India looks out into the world. For one, long-term competition, it is a long-term competition that is looming between two countries with which India engages diplomatically and economically. Just as US-Soviet competition did in the past, US-China rivalry will shape, if not be the primary context or environment in which Indian policymakers are operating in Asia. And this competition, like during the Cold War, US-China competition is likely to play out across multiple domains: geopolitical, economic, technological, and ideological, even your phones, in terms of TikTok. The fight about that is over US-China competition. It's also playing out this competition in several regional and international institutions. So as in the Cold War, you're also seeing that countries beyond the superpowers, that means countries beyond the US and China, will matter to the broader balance of power in the world. And they will try to exercise their own agency, their own decisions, based on their own perceptions and interests. So we're hearing a lot about the term Global South today. Part of what people are talking about is these countries want to make choices, and they won't necessarily be the choices we want them to make. They will make independent decisions, just as we saw non-aligned countries do in the Cold War. Now, India will also seek to make its own decisions. Just like in the past, Indian policymakers will try to maintain as much freedom of action, as much what they call strategic and decisional autonomy as possible, while ensuring India's security and its prosperity. And in the past, and in some ways, it will do this just as it did in the Cold War, where India will try to achieve these objectives by using the US-China rivalry to get benefits for itself from both countries, or from one country using its competition with the other. But India will also try to do this with using relationships with other countries, other major powers, who are also concerned and have competitions with China, and countries that have uncertainties about the US. Other similarities you will also see, indeed are already seeing another element you saw in the Cold War, which is that India will seek to work with other countries to help navigate the US-China bipolar competition. So yes, it will partner with the US, but it is also looking for other partnerships. It doesn't like to be over-dependent on any one country. And so by having partnerships with other countries, like Japan, like Australia, like Korea, like some Southeast Asian countries, like France, Germany, the UK, even Russia. For India, this helps create some space for itself, so it's not over-dependent on the US. Also, as in US-Soviet competition, today India will hope that US-China competition does not escalate to conflict or destabilize India's neighborhood, which could complicate India's development objectives. Like most countries that have that are still a developing country, India wants to focus on economic growth and development and realizes that any instability in Asia will spill over. So it does not want to see US-China competition escalate to conflict. But India will also, while it worries about the escalation, just as it did during the Cold War, India will worry, and perhaps to some extent worry even more, about potential cooperation between China and the US, that they will get very close and it will adversely or negatively affect India's interests, that it will reduce India's choices, that essentially India will get thrown under the bus as other Asian countries will if, for example, the US said, you know what, China, Asia is yours, you deal with it, we're not going to meet our commitments. We are happy making a deal with China of our own. That worries India as well, as it worried India during the US-Soviet competition. Another aspect that is similar for India as it looks at the environment today and comparing it to the US-Soviet Cold War will be that India worries that either the US or China will try to deepen ties with India's rivals. So I've already said, India worries about US-China cooperation, but it will also worry about either the US or China cooperating with its other rival, Pakistan. And in turn, the US and China worry about India's relationship with their opponents. So for example, the US worries about India's engagement with China and with Russia. China worries about Indian engagement with the US, with Japan, with Australia, and a range of its other rivals. So these are some of the similarities when you look at how India is seeing this world. Some of it seems familiar to India. We know how to deal with this. We did it before. We can play one of it against the other. We know what to worry about. But there are significant reasons why, for India, this competitive era is different from the Cold War for New Delhi. Why US-China competition is and will be different from US-Soviet competition when India looks at it. And it will offer different challenges and opportunities for policymakers in New Delhi. So for one, compared to the Cold War, today's two major rivals, during the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union had very little economic engagement, very little connectivity beyond a certain point. But today, the two major superpowers, the competitors, the US and China, are more interconnected with each other, particularly economically, than the US and Soviet Union were. And in some ways, they are more interdependent on each other than they are with India. So just to give you an example, foreign direct investment the year before COVID, US foreign direct investment in China was about $116 billion. US investment in India was only about $46 billion. US-China trade is close to the $600 billion range. US-India trade is just over, it's about $130 billion. So US-China economic engagement in some ways is deeper than US-India engagement is. Now, this China-US interdependence, which despite the rivalry, despite the US taking some measures to de-risk or decouple, the China-US interdependence will continue, and it will continue to fuel, to worry Indian policymakers that there could be that US-China deal that they worry about. On the flip side, the fact that the two countries are interdependent, US and China, that they have been engaging economically, technologically, could also magnify frictions between the US and China. We have seen this, and it could expand the battle space. So today, the reason people are arguing about, for example, not just TikTok, but the data that Shine is getting and sending back potentially to Chinese servers, is because there is that engagement. And it is usually the case that as trade increases, friction between countries also increases because suddenly you're dealing with each other on some difficult issues. Now for India, the reason this US-China kind of concern about each other, particularly US concerns about China economically and technologically, and in the past China has played on this with India as well to try to engage India. But the way this benefits India or could benefit in India is, on the one hand, India shares many of Washington's and Europe's concerns about Beijing's economic policies and practices, including asymmetry. So, far more imports from China than exports to China, for example. And so India is likely to be able to coordinate an approach with the US much more, and this is likely to be more effective than India asking for change or looking for a solution. Just doesn't have that kind of scale. However, India will also be worried about and watching, or not worried, but it will closely watch how this China-US decoupling, disentangling plays out. Because this could benefit, we've already seen this a little bit, it's benefiting countries like Vietnam, but this could also benefit India if American companies and European companies or companies from other G7 countries start to see India as a potential alternative or diversification option. As they're diversifying their supply chains, they say, here's another country that offers scale and some similar and lower prices, so more cost effectiveness. Having said that, some American policies that come up due to US-China competition, if couched and applied very broadly, some American trade, investment, and immigration restrictions sparked by China could also affect India adversely too. So it's a mixed bag for India, nonetheless something it has to think about, which it didn't have to think about in the previous Cold War. Now another kind of reason as India thinks about this triangle, what is it thinking about, why is this period difference, is the global distribution of power, where power lies, in what countries and to what extent is also different today. Hence you hear this debate sometimes, is this a bipolar world or a multipolar world? Because there are several major and middle powers, particularly in Asia. So they might not be as large as the US and China, but they have considerable heft. Whether that's Japan, whether that's France, or the European Union as a whole, whether that is a country like Korea, for example, Indonesia, other countries as well. And many of these countries, many of these other powers, including India, might be more like-minded with the US when it comes to China, but they also have ties with China, as is the case with most European countries. And most have not joined and do not want to join one bloc. And so for India, this means there is a larger landscape of countries than during the Cold War, where the choice then was, yes, you could have partnerships as India did with Britain and France, but there were much fewer options in terms of countries. Today, India has, as it tries to maintain freedom of action, not get over-dependent on the US, not give up necessarily all its ties with China, India sees more potential partners today than it had in the Cold War. And this is helpful to India because India likes to maintain a diversification strategy. Multiple partners in terms of who it engages with. The other thing that is true today is India's own power and position are different today than they were in the Cold War. In the old Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, in that era, Delhi played a very active role in Asia and even globally during the first decade and a half of the Cold War. But there was a sense that it was punching above its weight. In 1947, when the US government was assessing these things, it considered India to be in the category of least important countries from its perspective. Today, India's power is in a different league. It is a state with one of the largest militaries in the world. It has nuclear weapons. It has an economy that is larger than 3 of the permanent 5 countries in the UN Security Council. It will in the foreseeable future become the 3rd largest economy in the world. And today it is an aid donor rather than an aid recipient in a way it used to be during the Cold War. It also has a membership of a number of key international and regional institutions. And it is a country that is being actively sought out as a partner. Earlier, India had to go and seek out partners. Now others are going to India. Now this position gives India more space, but it will also make it difficult for India to stay aloof, to say, you know what, you guys have your rivalry, we're going to stay out of this. India will end up having to it's going to be much harder for India to just step out and say, I'm not getting involved. Another key difference today is the geography of competition. In the US-Soviet competition, the main theater of this rivalry was in the transatlantic space. In Europe, there was, yes, friction in Asia, but the main theater, the primary theater, was the transatlantic space. Today, is the Asia, or Indo-Pacific, if you prefer that term, is the primary theater of competition. Not a secondary or associated one as it was in the Cold War. One of the great power rivals is India's neighbor, unlike the Cold War when the US and Soviet Union were distant superpowers. Part of Delhi's approach then was to try to resist competition, the Cold War, from spilling over into South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. But today, China-US competition is literally taking place at India's doorstep. That proximity means that sitting the competition out, as I said, and some have suggested in India, is an unrealistic option for India. It is not possible. So it can't just say not getting involved. And having China as a neighbor also shapes India's perception of China and the fact that it has its own rivalry with China, and that it makes it different. It makes it vulnerable to a different kind of leverage than either the US or Soviet Union had with India during the Cold War. Now, another key difference is the Moscow factor. For most of the Cold War, India found a willing partner in the Soviet Union. It was helping India develop. It was supplying India with military equipment. The exceptions of the Soviet Union seeing India and helping India as a partner were when the Soviet Union was allied with China particularly in the periods in the 1950s and 60s. But after what is called the Sino-Soviet split, and China and Russia, or the Soviet Union split, that was when that actually split benefited India. That was when the Soviet Union partnered with India against China and helped enhance India's military capabilities even further. So for India, the Soviet Union was always part of, as it thought about how do you balance China, how do you deal with a China that's much larger, it was through a set of partnerships that included the Soviet Union. India used to say the Soviet Union is our insurance policy against China taking action or attacking India. But today for India, as it looks at the situation, today Russia's relationship with China is even closer than Russia's relationship with India used to be. The Russian foreign minister has called China-Russia relations the best ever in history. Now this complicates India's options, even creates problems for India. Because on balance, whenever China and Russia have been close, that has been a problem for India. And so what India most worries about is that if there is ever a China-US or China-India problem at the border, if there's a conflict, that Russia, it's already taking a neutral role, that it'll actually take China's side. And because Russia remains, though it's much more reduced, remains one of India's key supplier of military equipment, this would pose a major problem for India. If suddenly Russia says, we're going to cut off supplies to you in the middle of a war you're fighting with China because we have a closer partnership with China. Now, you're also going to kind of see one of the things that I will talk about is, while I mentioned some differences, the crucial difference for India today, as it thinks about how to deal with US-China competition within this triangle, is that India's relationships with the US and China are very different than they were during the kind of Cold War with the US and Soviet Union. During the Cold War, India maintained ties with both Washington and Moscow. Delhi had certain differences with Moscow and Washington during the Cold War, but these were not fundamental disputes or conflicts of interest. But the nature of India, the India-US and India-China relationships are very different today. These are still, I could have probably represented these better graphically, but this is just to show you that the breadth and depth of the relationship between India and the US is far deeper and far wider than that with India and China. Whether you look at the diplomatic, defense and security, economic, people-to-people ties, cooperation in regional or global institutions, India's relationships with China and the US are very different. But perhaps the most significant difference is that for India, it has major problems, fundamental disputes with one of the two superpowers. On the one side for India, you have China, which alone, in conjunction with India's other rival, Pakistan, is perhaps India's most significant external strategic challenge today. They have a fundamentally different view of what Asia should look like than India thinks that China is. And on the other side, so in the other corner, I think this is boxing rings. So on the one side you have China. In the other corner you have the US, one of India's closest partners today. Prime Minister Modi has referred to it as an indispensable partner in India's economic and technological transformation. And the US has become a close partner in part because India sees it as a solution to its China problem. So the US and India have differences, that is true, we can talk about them, I'll talk about a few of them. But the US and India do not have fundamental disputes. That is not, however, the case with India and China. India has seen China as a geopolitical challenge since the late 1950s, alone, and as I said, sometimes accusing China and Pakistan with colluding with each other. Sometimes, the degree of threat perception in India vis-a-vis China has varied, and there have been different approaches that Indian policymakers have taken. But this idea of China as a strategic challenge has remained a consistent perception in for Indian foreign and security policymakers since the 50s. At the heart of India's concern about and competition with China lies the border dispute between the two countries. These two Asian giants have the longest undemarcated boundary in the world. They don't actually, there's a general sense of where the boundary lies, so when you see the maps of India and China, but they've not agreed on where precisely. They have competing claims to certain kind of massive tracts of land that each side holds. The two sides have fought a war over this boundary dispute. There have been additional border skirmishes and standoffs. They fought a war in 1962. Now, one thing India and China did do is, over the course of a 25-year period, they negotiated a set of agreements to manage this boundary dispute. And that paved the way for India-China cooperation. And that's why you saw on that list I showed you of kind of a lot of statistics. China is India's second largest trading partner. It used to be India's largest trading partner. And that was facilitated by the fact that the two countries had these set of agreements, and they agreed to maintain what they call peace and tranquility at the border. No sides would unilaterally make any changes, change the status quo, as they put it in diplomatic terminology. Since 2008, 2009, however, Indian policymakers have seen a shift in Beijing's behavior. They've seen Beijing not just vis-a-vis India, but in the region as more assertive. And their sense was that during the global financial crisis, there was a sense that the West had failed, that the West was declining, that was really China's time had come. That this was a time when Beijing, which had taken traditionally an attitude of hide and buy, hide your capabilities and intentions, bide your times, that this was in the past. And since Xi Jinping comes to office in 2012, that calm at the border which had prevailed also suddenly goes away. So you have multiple border skirmishes in 2013, in 2014, in 2017, and there's another one, and nonetheless the two sides continue to engage with each other. Think about it as an approach of competitive engagement. But this today has been replaced by an approach of armed coexistence. Why? Because there was another boundary crisis in 2020, in the spring and summer of 2020, which continues in some parts to today. Why was this one more serious than the previous ones that had come while Xi Jinping has been in office? Because Delhi accused the People's Liberation Army of having unilaterally changed the status quo at the border at multiple locations, not just one, which had been the case in previous crises. The crisis ended up involving the first fatalities of the border in 45 years between the two countries, the first shots fired at the boundary in decades, and larger deployments from both militaries, which remain to this day. Now, at some contested locations during this crisis, the two sides have disengaged, but they continue to face off at other locations, and there has been no de-escalation of forces near this boundary. It's a very long boundary, and both sides are kind of face-to-face all along it. It has brought the China-India relationship to the lowest point since the two countries fought a war in 1962. Now, the boundary crisis has hardened Indian views of China. It has the Indian government and public sees Beijing as having violated those agreements that I mentioned and say, how can we trust that you will stick to the other commitments you've made in other agreements? So now you have a more militarized border, and that's not going to change anytime soon. You've seen both sides build up infrastructure, build up their capabilities at the border, and you've seen that those in the Indian government who had been arguing, much like people did in the US, that India must engage with China economically to tie it into a web of interdependence. It would ease the political strains. Those people making that argument, their hands have been weakened within the Indian government. So now the China hawks dominate. Their arguments dominate within the Indian establishment. You've also seen that as a result of this boundary crisis, the concerns amongst the security establishment who had said, actually, you know, those economic ties, they're not an opportunity, they're a vulnerability. Their voice has become louder, and as a result, because India now thinks of engagement with China in the economic and technological space as a weakness rather than something that had been an opportunity, you've seen a slew of measures, policy measures in India that restrict or increase scrutiny of Chinese activities in a number of domains. Economic, technology, telecommunications, public diplomacy, education. India banned TikTok overnight. There was grumbling. Indian government said, we don't care. And not just that, but a number of, that's the one that gets a lot of attention, but 200, 300 apps, and they keep playing whack-a-mole because new ones come up and they ban them. But also significantly, India also started doubling down in terms of its foreign policy posture, and I'll come back to that, deepening ties with particular countries who also shared India's concerns about China. Now, beyond the border dispute, while that is the kind of core of the competition, India has a range of other kind of bilateral, regional, and global differences with China. And China has other differences with India too. So sometimes people will say, well, suppose the border stabilizes, will both sides, walk into the sunset together again? And the answer is no, because there are these other problems as well. They have a river, there's a river that goes from the Tibetan Plateau into India and then to Bangladesh, the Brahmaputra. They have differences on how you share the waters of that river. There's Indian concerns about the damming of the river as China is the upper riparian. China has concerns about India's influence in Tibet. China still has complaints that the Dalai Lama and a number of Tibetan refugees reside in India and were given refuge there. You also have kind of economic concerns. You have concerns about the economic ties being a subject, or China potentially using economic ties coercively. But you also, beyond these bilateral differences, have a range of regional differences that the two countries have. For India, concerned about the China-Pakistan relationship. India believes that China has helped build Pakistan's military and nuclear capabilities. You also have Indian concerns about China's growing activities in all of its neighbors. India's concern is not just that there's economic activity, that it's coming with strategic and political influence, including Beijing saying to these countries, do not respect India's, and not just the US, don't engage with India, don't engage with the US, don't engage with Japan. There's also concern about dual purpose infrastructure. China, on its part, is concerned about India's ties with the US, with Japan, with several countries in Southeast Asia around its border, including most recently the Philippines. But there's another kind of fundamental difference that India has with China, which is that it has kind of a different vision from its perspective of what it believes China wants in the region. It thinks China wants a unipolar Asia where Beijing gets to set the terms, and India says it does not want that. It wants a multipolar Asia. It is deeply concerned not just about unilateral changes of status quo at its border, but also in the South China Sea, also in the Taiwan Strait, also in the East China Sea, thinking, as one former Indian Navy chief said, we don't want what they're doing in the South China Sea today to happen in the Indian Ocean tomorrow. Beyond that, there's a range of kind of global concerns that India has, including, and this used to be, India and China used to cooperate actually quite a bit in the multilateral space. India and the US used to disagree fundamentally about trade and other issues. Today, even this has become an area of competition between India and China. Now, there's still areas of competition. They're both members of the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping, which was recently expanded. They're members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But largely, even in this domain, this competition is spilling over. And fundamentally, there is this lack of trust. Now, the fundamental point is that I'm making with kind of these differences is that unlike the Cold War, India is faced with the fact that with China-US competition, one of the two competitors is its own main rival, if not adversary, which rules out walking that middle path strategically or staying aloof in a way that it might even have wanted to. That is not an option. It cannot really hedge between the US and China, as perhaps some other countries will do and can do. And all this shapes kind of India's choices, which are not what they were during the Cold War. Non-alignment is not feasible because India is very much involved. An alliance is not something that India desires, and it's not even an offer. So what is the answer? It lies in India's own history, and the answer is alignment or tilting or leaning, which means that India has done this twice in the past, both times to balance China. In the 1960s, it aligned with the US to balance China. In the 1970s, it aligned with the Soviet Union to balance China. And so what you've seen is that this alignment, as opposed to alliance and non-alignment, it recognizes that India is unlikely to make the accommodations or concessions to China that will make it be able to play a non-aligned role. But it also recognizes that with the China-India capabilities gap being what it is, India needs partners. 30 years ago, India and China had economies the same size. Today, China's economy is more than 5 times India's. So India needs partners. And it needs partners to help it build capabilities, and particularly the US, and this is where the US comes in. Why is India looking to the US? It needs the US to help build its own capabilities because it wants that to help offer alternatives in the region and to help maintain a favorable balance of power in the region. And this is why you've seen deeper Indian ties with the US, which has been facilitated by the fact that the US, for the reasons mentioned in the slide, also sees India as useful as the US competes with China. Now I'm actually going to, because I've got 2 minutes left, I think, by my count, so I'm going to just very quickly make the point, and we can talk about it more deeply, is that you have seen an India-US relationship as a result, which has deepened across the board. Secretary of Defense Austin is in India right now. Secretary of State Blinken is in India right now. Because there's a series of new dialogues, they're going to be talking about China, they're going to be talking about the Middle East, they're also going to be talking about defense and security and intelligence cooperation in a way that is unprecedented. And to give you an example of how much this has changed in a short period of time, 25 years ago there were US sanctions on India. Today, the US is perhaps India's closest defense and security partner. Now, I'm not going to go through all that India and the US are doing, lots of military exercises now, lots of dialogues. But one thing I do want to talk about, just briefly, is what is different about India-US cooperation today. It's not just happening bilaterally. It's happening with something called the Quad, with the quadrilateral, with Australia, India, Japan, and the US. It is happening with something called the I2U2, with the US, India, Israel, and UAE. There's a newly announced India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which is backed by the US. So there's a lot of engagement taking place, some vis-a-vis trying to offer alternatives to what China's offering, some to balance China, but some for economic and to deepen economic and technological ties more deeply. Now, I will not talk about limits here, but I will say there are some limits. China, India, and the US don't see China the same way. But there's also this aspect of differences on things like Russia, the differences on trade, difference on democracy and human rights, differences sometimes even in terms of how they see situations around the world or how they approach, for example, the developing world. So it's not like they're not limits to the US-India partnership, but you are seeing that this triangle today looks the way it did in the 60s because you're seeing an India that is deeply concerned about China. And I'll stop there. That one point of that fact that they agree that there's strategic convergence between India and the US means it incentivizes both countries to manage differences.
Thank you very much, Dr. Madan, for this really insightful and illustrious talk about these very complex relationships. We do have a little bit of time, so I would like to collect some questions from the audience. And if you could please briefly introduce yourself and what you study, if you are a student, and if you don't study, that's okay too. And yes.
And if I'm happy to answer questions about India more broadly. Indian foreign policy, it doesn't have to be on India, China, and the US. So
yes,
have at it.
My name is Naseem Islam. I'm a poli-sci student in the Intelligence National Security track. And my question is...
one second, we have a second microphone, so thank you.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay.
Hello.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I'm Naseem Islam. I'm a poli-sci student, third-year student. I'm on the Intelligence and National Security track, and my question is what is it? One of India's neighbors, Bangladesh, I know has both economic and military ties to both India and China. There is a consensus with some Bangladeshi officials that they don't want to be, of course, economically dependent on India. So I was wondering what's India's solution on not trying to have Bangladesh lean more towards China, really, instead like more towards them, really.
It's a great question. In fact, there's a lot of work being done on exactly this. So part of the reason is India now is can't do what it's doing during the Cold War, but all of its, or most of its neighbors are. They are saying, just like India took advantage of the previous Cold War, got things out of the US and the Soviet Union, today, if you're Bangladesh, if you're Nepal, if you're Sri Lanka, if you're Maldives, if you're other Indian Ocean island states, you are going to play off one against the other. And they're playing off not just India and China, but the US and China as well. So in some ways, they're saying, this is not our war. This is not our competition. We're going to take advantage of it. We will remain non-aligned. Nobody uses the word non-aligned anymore, but these are a group of newly non-aligned countries. And they're not always in Asia and Africa or Latin America. They're countries in Europe who say the same thing about US-China competition. In some ways, this has required a mindset shift in India about its neighborhood. So when you look at South Asia, there are kind of essentially two sets of countries. There's aligned South Asia and there's non-aligned South Asia. Aligned South Asia, I would put Pakistan and Bhutan in that category. Pakistan is essentially aligned with China, Bhutan is aligned with India. Now both, also maintain, it's not like they don't deal with the other, but largely. But then those other countries that I mentioned, for them, kind of the approach that India's had to think of. They've been used to having a monopoly in the region. They're a regional hegemon. That is just how, just like the US is the regional hegemon here. So when you're used to having, it's like the business world. When you have a monopoly, you can sometimes get lazy, you don't make the right offer, you take it for granted, you can pressure them to do what you want. Now, it's a competitive marketplace because China's there too. And so China's making them offers, some of which India tried, for example. There's some, yes, India offered infrastructure projects. Sometimes, maybe they were they were more expensive. Or India said it has to meet certain standards. And China said, we don't care about that stuff. We're just going to come and build this. Now, Bangladesh has actually not taken as many, you might know, loans from China, but several other countries, Sri Lanka and Maldives in particular, Nepal to some extent, and signed on to a lot of the Belt and Road projects. Why? Because, they're politicians. They want to, yes, you might get something on the side, but essentially it's about delivering to your people. And China's saying, I'll build you a road in a short period of time, and nobody else is offering that. And the World Bank and the IMF and all would not. So China came with an offering that these countries found attractive. It also meant that India can't go to them and say, well, you can't, wag the finger at them and say, you can't engage with these countries. So what is India having to do? It's having to lift its game. It means kind of having to think about sometimes making non-reciprocal concessions. Saying, yeah, we'll do this for you, we won't expect something in return. It means saying, we will now give you options in terms of financing, infrastructure, and if we can't do it, we will encourage one of our like-minded partners to do it. So to give you a very specific example, just from 2 days ago, the US Development Finance Corporation is now financing $500 million worth of financing to an Indian company to build a port in Colombo. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a financing mechanism the US has given hundreds of millions of dollars in financing to Nepal. It is partly for projects that India is building, but it's cooperative. India and Japan are doing things together as well. So it's meant for India, one, offering more alternatives, second, changing its mindset about working with, India used to say, this is our neighborhood, it's like India's Monroe Doctrine, our neighborhood, everybody else stay out. Now, it's saying, you know what, we'll work with the US, we'll work with Japan, we'll work with, in fact, come, do more. That doesn't mean there won't be differences. India and the US, for example, have very different approaches to how they're approaching the upcoming election in Bangladesh. But that is going to be the case because India and the US is not a neighbor of Bangladesh for one, and has different set of concerns. So India is having to up its game. That does not mean that there will be certain discussions India will have with the governments in power and saying, look, there are some security red lines we have. By the way, it's not just economic space. It's going to be on the defense side. China is Bangladesh's largest source of military equipment. India has not really ever been in that game. So India has just announced $500 million worth of financing for Bangladesh to buy Indian military equipment. So again, just putting things on the table. Same with the US. Can't tell countries not to do things with China if you're not offering an alternative. Ideally, that alternative should be higher quality and should be of a set of standards that, especially in democracies, have a level of transparency and not fall into the same trap. You're criticizing Chinese contractors, same thing, you shouldn't be doing the same thing. So I think a lot of it is upping India's game and having to think through how even India deals with politics in these countries. India was, and without shame, would have put its thumb on the scale for one party or the other. Today, and in almost all these neighbors, there's considered a pro-India party and anti-India. Today, India is having to, Bangladesh being an exception, but in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, there's somebody who's come to power who came to power on an anti-India scene. India will engage with it because they realize if they don't, they're leaving a vacuum for China. So it's required a mindset shift for India, but it's still kind of going to be a challenge continuously.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just ask 3 or 4, and then
sure.
we can pull them. So there was, you first? Go ahead. One second, the microphone is about to in there. So let's collect 3 or 4 questions.
Victoria Garofula, I'm a political science major. I just had like a brief question, it's kind of vague. So do you think that India's economy is kind of more similar to China compared to the US? Because I know that China is known for having like strict regulations. Or do you think it's more just like by itself?
It's a very good question, by the way, not vague.
Somebody have a question?
Hi, Akash, Electrical Engineering. So my question is, how do you think the 9-line would affect the India-US-China relationship in the future?
Thank you. And then we had 2 questions over there, and then we'll give you a minute to answer.
My name is Sumbo, first year Ph.D. student. My question is, with China's relative expansion in Africa and the strategic relationship with most African countries, what does this leave US-China relationship, and then how does it really affect China's relationship with India and then India's relationship with the US?
My name is Chase Cuthbert. I'm a senior policy and international relations. I had a question about two of India's largest neighbors, Myanmar and Pakistan, currently are facing large-scale security and political threats. How does India really respond to that, and especially in the idea of it potentially spilling over into their own borders?
Great, thank you very much. We'll give you a minute to.
So I have 1 minute?
have a few minutes.
Okay, by the way, these are really excellent questions. Let me take the one on India's economy. It's actually quite interesting because I think India it used to be called, when I was growing up in India, a mixed economy, which was not quite, fully socialist but not capitalist. There was a private sector, it tended to be more domestic but closed. Since liberalization, India lies kind of somewhere between, it is sui generis, as they say, in its own right. Several kind of, it is more private sector friendly in some ways. There are a lot more, just had a longer private sector than China. Now China has these big national champions, but nonetheless India's had a longer history of that. You also don't see things like, you don't see kind of government officials sitting in private sector companies. So there's that, the private sector is a genuinely kind of private sector. Other thing is China had an export-led economy. India's has not been. India also has, for example, consumption rates have been higher. And so India has had a domestic market. China's been trying to encourage consumers to spend. India has not had as much of that problem. It is now actually trying to do some things that China did well. Increase manufacturing. So part of the effort is to build infrastructure, build logistics, learn from China in terms of how it did some things well. But it's also, for example, traditionally always had a services sector that has been kind of world-beating in some senses. And that's changed a little bit. And it's similar to China in what China's done in the manufacturing space, where it started out lower down the value chain, is moving up. That's happening to Indian services. It used to be the back office, and sometimes you still call up people in customer services and be a person from India. But now, companies here are setting up their research and development facilities in India. A lot of semiconductor design is done in India, significant amount. So it's moving up the value chain in services. It's different. So it's not quite as open as a kind of free market capitalist. There's still India will put its thumb on the scale for domestic businesses. To some extent, you can argue everybody does that. But nonetheless, so it's not exactly like China, but it's not also a typical kind of Western company the same way. Just on regulations, it does have a lot more than we do here. But also it has a different attitude and approach for societal and political reasons to things like data and how to handle that. In some ways, actually much more similar to the Europeans than to us. The question about the 9-dash line. I think where it could potentially implicate the US-China-India relationship is more if there's a conflagration. If there's some sort of crisis and the way things are going, you never know if something might actually happen. India's position is far closer to the US's. It sees 9-dash line as an example of China not, kind of creating facts on the ground and fait accompli. So in fact, in 2020, it said, basically, we think China is trying to do salami slicing on land as it's done in the South China Sea. So India is very clear, it's now given a very public position that, for example, China should accept the arbiter of the war, which the Philippines won. The other thing that India is doing, sometimes in coordination with the US, sometimes independently, is it works, it has a traditional partnership with Vietnam, one of the South China Sea claimants, now with Philippines, and partly what India is doing is helping them build their Coast Guard capabilities. The one thing that India is doing with the US very actively, India, US, Japan, and Australia have something called the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness, which is going to give not just the South China Sea claimants, but Pacific Islands and others a better access to technology where they themselves can see what their waters look like. More because of the concern not on sovereignty grounds, on fisheries and overfishing, on illegal fishing. That's what their concerns are, that's what they've asked for. So there's a lot of work. But I think India would be most concerned about a crisis kind of spilling over, in which case its position would be much closer to that of the US. Not because of the US, but because of its own interests and partnerships in the region. Very quickly on the Africa question, in some ways it is similar to what I said about India in South Asia, which is, in terms of US-China competition, I think it is. Now you are actually hearing people talk about Chinese projects in Africa in a way. They're not new, as you know. They go back. Nobody was paying attention to them here. Now, because they're seen through the prism of US-China competition, there's a lot more attention. Now, in an ideal world, and I think this is, the Biden administration has done this, and it's a good thing to do this. If you see things through only a competitive prism, then you're always thinking in wins and losses. And you're always thinking, well, they have to be on our side or they're on the other person's side. Some of it is accepting a draw. Now, we're not very good at it, playing sports that have draws. We like wins or losses. And so I actually think approaching African countries through just the prism of US-China competition would be a mistake. And I'm glad you've seen there is some aspect that's bringing more attention. It will bring more resources. So the Development Finance Corporation will just devote more resources now because of US-China competition. The US was getting out of the development financing business. The Congress was about to wind down the Export-Import Bank. Instead, because of US-China competition, they now double down and double the funding. So a lot of that will go to projects in Africa. The idea is to try to kind of facilitate private sector financing. That's always been tough. But the US is also, in Africa in particular, thinking differently. So it's not just financing American companies that operate in Africa, but financing either local or, for example, to give you a very minor example, the US is financing an Indian company to build healthcare facilities in Nigeria. The caveat for that funding to that Indian company is that they capacity build amongst Nigerians. So the idea being, it's not just everybody else is going and creating things, that you're actually creating. US also now creating vaccine production facilities in Africa, learning the lesson from COVID, because one thing they heard from the African Union as a whole, but African countries, is you guys all forgot about us. You shut down, you got your vaccines, and you impose restrictions on us, including countries like South Africa. So you're seeing the US having to think about these things in the context of US-China competition, but also realizing that if it only looks at everything through that, it is going to not be welcome beyond a point, because it's going to repeat what the US. So you're seeing a lot more engagement on the part of US, number of trips, number of cabinet officials have gone. But the one thing that people keep hearing is, it's good that you started showing up, but you have to deliver high quality alternatives. In some places you are seeing the US and Africa thinking about, for example, the new thing that everybody's talking about is critical minerals. And so you're seeing in certain areas working with countries that have resources to make sure that they have the financing to do it, but in an environmentally sustainable way, and that it's creating jobs for locals. So part of this is that, much like India's case in South Asia, when the US is going, whether it's in Africa, Latin America, it cannot just say, don't do this with so-and-so country. The one other thing that is coming to the fore is on the defense side, which is there is concern about, for example, the Chinese having a base in Djibouti, about trying to get access to other, whether it's bases or places, access in African countries. And the third thing that the US is keeping an eye on is, just like there's IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing in South Asia, we're starting to see it in West Africa as well. That becoming a concern. You take it from me, the moment if we'll see a big flare-up of attention, etc., if China does get a base anywhere on the West African, on the Atlantic side. And so you will see interest levels, and there'll be panic at that point. But nonetheless, so the US is having to think about Africa as a whole, but even sub-regions now very differently than it was before. I know I'm over time, but I just very quickly, I do want to answer the final question about Myanmar and Pakistan. To some extent, India worries about both, but in different ways. In the Pakistan case, India worries more about what this poly-crisis in Pakistan means for potentially stability there, but what it might mean for potentially some of these extremist groups, these terrorist groups based there, and what it might mean for stability. Or, there's always the thing of, to take pressure off the domestic situation. Does some part of the military decide we're going to take action against India, which to get a rally around the flag effect. So that's what the concern is. India can do very little in terms of the domestic political situation in Pakistan. So India's attitude to the domestic political situation in Pakistan has generally been, to actually see how the US and others are engaging China to some extent, but it has had. Its philosophy has been, we have to deal with whoever's in power. In Myanmar, it's somewhat different. India is stuck between a rock and a hard place. It was the only country in the 80s, only Asian country that stood up for democracy in Myanmar. The junta, the military junta had come to power. They isolated, kind of left India out in the cold. But two things happened? Extremist groups, insurgents, not extremist groups, insurgents that based themselves in northern Burma started coming into, because there is a border with Burma. So insurgents in some northeastern states, they started basing themselves in Burma. And the military junta would let them operate. Second thing that happened is China made inroads. And so India changed its policies during the 1990s, saying we have to engage with the military junta. They were very pleased to see when it looked like democratization was coming. India's philosophy is they will deal around the world with whoever is in power. They don't make these decisions. They're sovereignty hawks about these things. they generally believe that the democracies are more stable, including in their neighborhood. So they have a long-standing relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi, with her father. They had high hopes for that. They've been particularly concerned about what's happened with the Rohingya. Now, this government has said they don't want Rohingyas coming into India. They are supporting Bangladesh, which is getting, and so they're worried about Bangladeshi stability. They have a close relationship. But Bangladesh and others some in India have been critical of the Indian government for not engaging or for not pressing the military more. They do it, but they do it privately. They also take their lead from ASEAN in terms of an approach. The other big concern is they had a lot of connectivity projects. Most of them go through Rakhine State, Shan State. None of these things are going to materialize. And then finally, their concern is that the military, which doesn't have any love lost for Beijing, but needs them to not get isolated, will make further inroads. They're very worried about the port of Chokpyo. So they're essentially working they and the Japanese have taken a very different approach than the US, saying, we're going to engage with the military, but we don't like it. We actually want to see this change. We want more stability there. We don't want to see this spillover. But there's very little beyond a point. We're not going to isolate them.
Great. Thank you. All for attending. Thank you again our student volunteers for helping out and making this possible, and Laila Chaco, and please join me for another round of applause for Dr.
Thank you so
Madan.
much.